James River Valley, Dakota Territory, October, 1873. The autumn air was sharp, carrying the scent of frost and the vast, empty promise of the plains. Most men were banking earth against the foundations of their cabins, patching roofs, and stacking the last of the cordwood. Eamon Doherty was hauling freshly milled planks of cottonwood into the derelict stone silo that stood on the edge of Judd Felton's property. The silo was a relic from a failed cattle baron, a 20-foot wide, 30-foot high stone cylinder, roofless and forgotten. To everyone in the settlement, it was a landmark of failure. To Eamon, it was the answer to a prayer he hadn't known how to speak. Judd Felton himself, owner of the new grain elevator and the most prosperous man in the valley, strode out to the silo, his boots crunching on the hardened ground. Two other settlers, Silas Croft and Abe Miller, followed in his wake, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and condescension. "Doherty!" Felton called out, his voice accustomed to command. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" Eamon emerged from the dark maw of the silo's main opening, blinking in the pale sunlight. He was a man of medium height, with the quiet, powerful build of someone who had spent a lifetime wrestling oak staves into submission. He wiped a hand on his trousers. "I'm building my home, Mr. Felton." Silas Croft let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Building it in there? You'll freeze like a side of beef, stone sweats, man. You'll be encased in ice by January." "It's a fool's errand, Eamon," Abe Miller added, more kindly but with no less certainty. "That thing's a wind trap. It'll howl like a banshee in a blizzard." Felton's concern was more practical, more proprietary. "That silo is on my land. I let you use it for storage, not for some mad experiment. You start putting fires in there, you'll get expansion and contraction. That stone is old. It cracks. And I'll have a claim for damages against you that'll take 10 years to work off." He pointed a thick finger at Eamon. "It's a crazy idea, and you'll not be doing it at my expense." Eamon Doherty looked from Felton's stern face to the smirking men beside him. He simply nodded, his gaze calm. "The stone will be fine, Mr. Felton," he said, then turned and carried another plank into the darkness of the silo, leaving the three men standing in the wind, shaking their heads. What did this Irish cooper, this barrel maker from a wet, green island, understand about the physics of convection that the most experienced builders on the Dakota Plains had missed? This channel is dedicated to the stories of forgotten frontier ingenuity. The solutions these pioneers found weren't just clever, they were born from brutal necessity and a deep understanding of the forces of nature. If you believe wisdom is often found where no one is looking, consider subscribing to our channel. I promise that by the end of this story, you will understand the profound power of still air in a way you never have before. What's the most unconventional home you've ever seen? Let us know in the comments below. Eamon Doherty was not a carpenter. He was not a stonemason, and he certainly wasn't a frontiersman in the way the men who mocked him were. He was a cooper. His entire life from boyhood in County Clare had been spent not with walls and roofs, but with staves, adze, and iron hoops. His hands didn't know the language of mortise and tenon. They knew the secret geometry of the cylinder. They knew how to shape dozens of individual pieces of wood into a single, perfect, watertight vessel, a container capable of holding a quiet liquid against all the pressures of the outside world. He understood that the integrity of a barrel wasn't in the thickness of its wood, but in the perfection of its joints. A barrel held calm. He had arrived in the Dakota Territory 2 years prior with his wife Siobhan and their 2 small children, Finn and Maeve. They had come for the promise of land, a promise that felt impossibly vast after a life lived on a rented parcel of green dampness. They built their first cabin like everyone else, logs, chinking of mud and grass, and a stone hearth. It was a sturdy, honest structure that would have been a fine home back in Ireland. Here, it was a death trap. The first winter, 1872, had been a lesson taught with the brutal pedagogy of the plains. The wind was not like the gales off the Atlantic. This wind was a physical presence, a relentless, grinding force that seemed to possess a malevolent intelligence. It didn't just blow against the cabin, it searched it. It found every microscopic gap in the chinking and, with the patience of a predator, worried it, picked at it, and stripped it away. Eamon would spend hours mixing mud and straw with freezing water, his hands raw, patching the holes, only to have the wind claw them open again a day later. Inside was a special kind of misery. The heat from their small cast-iron stove didn't radiate outwards in a comforting circle. It rose, bent sideways in the drafts, and vanished through the walls. Siobhan would hang blankets, creating a small tent-like space around the stove, but even there the cold was a palpable thing. Eamon would never forget the image that fueled his desperate innovation: a tin cup of water, placed on the floor no more than 3 feet from the glowing red stove, freezing solid in under an hour. The problem wasn't the cold, it was the movement of the air. The house was breathing, and its every exhalation was their warmth, their life, their hope. That winter, Finn developed a cough that rattled in his small chest for months, and Maeve's laughter, once a constant melody, grew thin and rare. Eamon swore they would not endure another winter like it. The failure of a standard frontier cabin in a high-wind environment was a catastrophic lesson in thermodynamics, taught over and over again across the plains. The settlers, men of immense practical skill, understood insulation. They knew a thick log wall was better than a thin one. They knew banking earth against the foundation helped. What they fundamentally misdiagnosed was the primary enemy. They believed they were fighting the cold. They were actually fighting convection. Convection is the transfer of heat through the movement of a fluid, in this case, air. A log cabin in the Dakota Territory was assaulted by 2 forms of it simultaneously. The first was forced convection driven by the wind. A 40-mile-per-hour gale at minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit doesn't just make a surface cold. It actively strips heat away at an astonishing rate. Every square inch of the cabin's outer wall was subjected to a continuous barrage of supercooled, fast-moving air molecules, each one colliding with the wall and carrying away a tiny parcel of precious heat, or BTUS. The chinking, no matter how well applied, would inevitably have hairline cracks. The wind turned these cracks into high-pressure jets, forcing Arctic air directly into the living space. This was air infiltration, a direct and devastating breach. The second, more insidious enemy was natural convection, which took place inside the cabin itself. Even in a perfectly sealed room, the air is never still. The air heated by the stove would rise. Following the basic law of physics, it would travel across the ceiling until it reached the cold outer walls. There, it would cool rapidly, become denser, and sink back to the floor. This created a continuous, invisible loop of air, a thermal siphon that constantly circulated warmth away from the occupants and delivered chilled air right back to their feet. This is why their feet were always cold. This is why the water froze next to the fire. The cabin was a machine for generating drafts, its own worst enemy. Families like the Gundersons and the Schmidts burned through enormous stacks of wood, sometimes an entire cord in 2 weeks, just to maintain a barely livable temperature near the stove, while the corners of their homes remained thick with frost. They were trying to heat the entire James River Valley, one stove full at a time. The more they stoked the fire, the faster the convective loop spun, and the more heat was lost through the walls. It was a losing battle against physics itself. Eamon Doherty, the cooper, saw the problem differently. He wasn't trying to build a thicker wall to fight the cold. He was trying to build a vessel to hold the calm. His work inside the silo was methodical and, to the onlookers, utterly bizarre. He wasn't building against the stone walls, he was ignoring them. First, he laid a heavy timber floor, raised about a foot off the packed earth base of the silo, creating a crawl space. Then, he began to build his house. It was not square, it was a circle. Using techniques honed over a lifetime of barrel making, he framed a perfectly round 2-story structure 16 feet in diameter, centered precisely inside the 20-foot diameter of the silo. This left a uniform 3-foot gap between his outer wall and the inner surface of the stone. "He's building a barrel," Silas Croft remarked to a group of men gathered at a safe distance one afternoon. "A round house, damnedest thing I ever saw." Judd Felton was less amused. "He's wasting good lumber. And I'm telling you, that inner structure will shift and press against the stone. He's a fool." He approached Eamon, who was meticulously fitting a section of curved wall. "Doherty, I've warned you. I see one crack in that stone, and I'm holding you liable." Eamon paused, sighting down the curve of the wall. "There will be no pressure on your stone, Mr. Felton," he said, his voice even. "My house won't be touching it." He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He simply returned to his work, tapping a joint into place with a mallet. The sound was a clean, solid thud, the sound of something fitting exactly as it was meant to. His cooper's skills were evident everywhere. Where a normal carpenter would have struggled with the curves, Eamon moved with an innate understanding of radial geometry. He built the walls in vertical sections, like staves, ensuring they were incredibly tight. He used tongue and groove joints on every plank. The outer sheathing of his small, round house was as seamless as the hull of a ship. He built 2 floors, with a small, steep staircase and a single stovepipe that rose through the center of the structure. He then built a simple, shallow-pitched conical roof on his cabin, leaving a massive, dark, open space above it, leading to the top of the silo. The entire structure was freestanding, a ship in a bottle. His wife, Siobhan, brought him his lunch each day. "They think you're mad, you know," she said quietly, handing him a parcel of bread and cheese. Eamon looked at the space around them, the 3-foot buffer of air that separated their nascent home from the cold, gray stone. "Let them," he said. "This air's our wall. They just can't see it yet." The mockery lasted for 6 weeks of construction. The validation, he knew, would last a lifetime. To understand the genius of what Eamon Doherty built, you have to understand the properties of the material he used as his primary defense, air. On its own, air is a fantastic insulator. The secret to the insulating power of materials like wool, down feathers, or fiberglass is not the material itself, but the millions of tiny pockets of air trapped within their fibers. If air is held perfectly still, it transfers heat very poorly. The problem is that air is almost never still. Eamon had created a system of nested defenses against convection. The first layer was the massive stone wall of the silo itself. This was his windbreak. It was not insulation. Stone is a poor insulator. Its job was to absorb the kinetic energy of the wind, to face the -20-degree gale, and the relentless forced convection. It was the breakwater against the storm. The wind could howl and scour the outside of that stone wall for weeks, but the air on the inside of the wall would remain relatively undisturbed. This created the second, and most critical layer of defense, the 3-foot buffer of air between the silo wall and the cabin wall. This was Eamon's true innovation. Because the silo wall had killed the wind, this massive column of air was protected from forced convection. It was subject only to the much weaker force of natural convection. The air touching the cold inner stone wall would cool and sink. while the air touching the warmer outer wall of the cabin would rise. But because the space was so large and the temperature difference relatively small, this convective loop would be incredibly slow and lazy. It was no longer a heat-sucking vortex. It was a gentle thermal creep. This meant that the outer wall of Eamon's living space wasn't fighting a -20-degree gale. It was facing a wall of calm, 10 or 20-degree air. The heat loss, or delta T, was dramatically reduced. A standard log wall losing heat to a 40-mile-per-hour wind at -20 degrees Fahrenheit might shed 500 BTUs per hour per square foot. Eamon's wall, losing heat to still 20 degrees Fahrenheit air, might lose only 50. He had reduced his home's primary source of heat loss by 90% simply by building a container for still air. The final layer was the cabin itself. Built with the obsessive tightness of a Cooper, it had virtually zero air infiltration. The small amount of natural convection inside the round rooms was easily overcome by the gentle, radiant heat of the small stove. He hadn't built a house. He had built a thermal fortress where the moat was a ring of air. That November, the winter arrived not as a gradual decline, but as an assault. A weather system the newspapers would later call the Great Plains Gale settled over the territory. For 18 consecutive days, the temperature never rose above -20 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind blew at a constant 30 to 40 miles per hour, with gusts that sounded like a freight train passing an inch from your ear. The world shrank to the interior of a cabin, and survival was measured in cords of wood. At the Felton house, a large and well-built structure by any conventional measure, the battle was constant. Judd and his eldest son fed the big potbelly stove around the clock. The windows were opaque, with a thick, fern-like layer of interior frost. Despite 2 layers of wool blankets on the beds, the family slept in their coats. The sound of the wind was a physical pressure on the walls, a deep, vibrating hum that frayed the nerves. Inside Eamon Doherty's silo there was quiet. The roar of the gale was a distant thing, a muffled, deep-throated rumble like a faraway ocean. It was the sound of a storm happening somewhere else. Inside the round walls of their home, the air was still and warm. The small stove glowed with a modest fire, consuming less than a quarter of the wood the Feltons were burning. Siobhan kept a small pot of herbs, parsley and thyme, on a crate near their single double-paned window. The glass was cool to the touch but completely clear. There was not a speck of frost. On the floor, Finn, his cough long since vanished, and Maeve lay on their bellies on a buffalo robe, drawing on slate boards with chalk. The air was so placid, so uniformly warm, that they lived in the entire space, from wall to wall, floor to ceiling. They had defeated the tyranny of the convective loop. One evening, Siobhan was preparing a simple stew. The smell of onions and simmering beef filled the cozy space. She listened to the faint, distant moan of the wind and looked at her children, safe and warm on the floor. She touched Eamon's arm. "It's like being in the heart of a stone," she whispered. Eamon nodded, watching the steady, unwavering flame of the oil lamp on their small table. The quietest place on the plains was inside the thing the wind had tried, and failed, to break. They were not just surviving the storm. They were living through it, untouched. The greatest luxury on the frozen prairie wasn't food or fuel. It was stillness. On the 8th day of the gale, a freighter named Tom Harding was fighting a losing battle 3 miles east of the settlement. He was hauling winter supplies for the army post, and one of the axles on his heavy wagon had cracked. His 2 mules, exhausted and encrusted with ice, were beginning to fail. The wind was scouring, driving snow so thick that he couldn't see more than 10 feet. He knew he would die if he stayed with the wagon. Abandoning his cargo, he unhitched the mules and, with the wind at his back, began stumbling toward the faint hope of the settlement. He was half blinded by snow and nearly frozen when he blundered into the hulking shape of the silo. He recognized it: Doherty's folly. To him it was a miracle, a stone wall to block the killing wind. He found the main door, a simple plank affair Eamon had installed, and forced it open against the drift. He stumbled inside, pulling the mules in after him, and fell to his knees in the relative quiet. He expected to die there, but more slowly out of the wind. He found himself in the 3-foot gap between the stone wall and a smooth, curved wooden wall. He pressed his back against the wood. It was not warm, but it wasn't cold either. It wasn't leeching the life out of him. The air in the space was dead still. There was no draft, no whisper of the hurricane raging just inches away through the stone. The mules, sensing the reprieve, stood with their heads down, their shivering slowly subsiding. Harding, disoriented and exhausted, curled up at the base of the inner wall and fell into a stupor that became sleep. He awoke hours later to a profound silence. The wind had momentarily died down. He was stiff and cold, but he was alive. He could hear the faint murmur of voices from inside the wooden structure. He staggered back out into the gray dawn and made his way to the settlement, to the only place he knew would be open: Judd Felton's grain elevator. Felton found him huddled by the office stove, wrapped in horse blankets, telling his story to a small group of astonished men. "And I slept in the gap," Harding said, his voice hoarse, "between the stone and his wooden barrel." The wind was screaming, but in there, it was just quiet. The air wasn't even that cold. It felt like a cellar in autumn. Saved my life. Judd Felton's face, normally set in lines of hard confidence, was a mask of disbelief. He looked at Silas Croft, then at the freighter. Without a word, he pulled on his heavy coat and boots. "Come on," he said to Silas. They walked to the silo, the newly risen wind tearing at them. Eamon answered their knock, his expression unreadable. He simply stood aside and let them in. They stepped out of the gale and into the silo's buffer zone. The change was instantaneous and shocking. The world went from a screaming chaos to absolute unnerving silence. Felton stood there, his face exposed, feeling for a draft that wasn't there. He looked down. On a small crate just inside the main door sat a tallow candle in a simple holder. It was unlit. "Eamon," Felton said, his voice low, "would you light that for me?" Eamon nodded. He struck a match and lit the wick. The flame rose, a perfect, unwavering teardrop of light. It did not dance. It did not flicker. It did not bend. It was utterly, preternaturally still. Eamon then opened the door to the inner cabin. A soft wave of warmth and the smell of baking bread washed over them. The candle flame did not move. Felton stared at the perfect flame, then at the warm light spilling from the inner cabin. He finally understood. He had been trying to build a fortress of logs, while Eamon had built a sanctuary of air. He looked at the Irish cooper, a man he had called a fool, and a lifetime of frontier certainty crumbled. "My God, Eamon," Felton said, his voice filled with a new and profound respect. "You didn't build a house. You built a calm inside the storm." The story of Tom Harding's survival and the miracle of the still candle became the talk of the settlement. The mockery directed at Eamon Doherty curdled into awe. Men who had laughed at his barrel house now came by, hats in hand, to ask if they could see it. Eamon, without a hint of triumphalism, showed every one of them. He explained the principle simply: the stone takes the wind. The air holds the warmth. The house just has to be tight. That spring, the idea began to spread, but its most significant leap came from an unexpected source. A surveyor for the Northern Pacific Railroad, a man named Alistair Finch, was in the valley mapping a potential spur line. He was an engineer by training, a man of calculations and physics. He heard the story and, intrigued, spent an entire afternoon with Eamon, taking precise measurements of the silo, the cabin, the gap. He recorded temperature readings inside, outside, and in the buffer zone. Finch was astounded. He saw not a piece of folk wisdom, but a brilliant, intuitive piece of engineering. In his next official depot report sent back to the regional office in Fargo, alongside charts of topographical gradients and soil composition, he included a special section. It was titled, An Analysis of a Novel Frontier Dwelling for High Advection Environments. He included detailed sketches of Eamon's silo home, cross-sections, and his calculations on its thermal efficiency. He estimated it reduced fuel consumption by over 70% compared to a standard dwelling of similar size. That report was copied and circulated among the railroad's land agents and engineers. When new waves of settlers arrived, brought in by the railroad, the agents would tell them about the harsh Dakota winters. And some would show them Finch's sketch. The idea of a house within a house, of a Doherty shell, began to appear in other forms. Some built double-walled sod houses. Others built small cabins inside larger barns. The principle, once demonstrated, was too powerful to ignore. The technique Eamon Doherty had pioneered was a century ahead of its time. He had, without the formal language, created a perfect pressure-equalized rain screen and a super-insulated wall assembly. Modern building science is built on this very principle, that the air barrier and the insulation layer are two different things, and that controlling air movement is the single most important factor in creating an efficient, comfortable structure. Eamon's silo home was a testament to the idea that a deep understanding of a single craft, the cooper's obsession with the integrity of a vessel, could unlock a solution to a problem far outside its own domain. There is a profound lesson in the silent, circular walls of Eamon Doherty's home. The James River Valley didn't reward the strongest arm or the loudest voice. It rewarded what worked. The settlers had looked at the abandoned silo and seen a ruin, a monument to a past failure. Eamon looked at it and saw the answer. He saw a structure that the wind had already assaulted for years, a cylinder of stone that had proven it could not be broken by the gales. He didn't try to fight the wind. He enlisted its greatest enemy, stillness. The theme the plains taught was this: the stillest air, the most profound peace, hides inside the very thing the wind has already tried its best to break. He understood what barrel makers have always known, that the purpose of a strong exterior is not to be the shelter itself, but to protect the perfect, inviolable calm held within. He built a barrel for his family and filled it with peace, while the storm raged on, outside and unheard. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier resilience. If you found this exploration of historical engineering as fascinating as we did, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more content. We believe the past holds countless lessons for the present. Let us know in the comments. What modern technology do you think was foreshadowed by a piece of simple frontier Afrique based in a peaceable frontier ingenuity? The content of this video is for educational and storytelling purposes. It presents a fictionalized narrative inspired by historical building practices and principles. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are products of creative reconstruction. While the scientific and engineering principles discussed are based on established knowledge, any application of these or similar techniques today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety standards, and professional engineering advice. This video does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.